Comrades and friends, all of you attending the 6th International Assembly of the International League of People's Struggle, I greet you in solidarity and struggle on the road to liberation, on the road to justice for all of our causes and for all of our global struggle to confront capitalism, racism, Zionism, imperialism, and reaction. I know that you were waiting today to hear from a Palestinian keynote speaker, from Khaled Barakat, the Palestinian writer, activist, leftist, and struggler. You were waiting to hear his analysis, and you were waiting to hear what he has to say about the critical tasks of resistance today amid the ongoing crimes of imperialism, not only in Palestine, but around the world. And I know that he would love nothing more than to be speaking with you today, whether in person or even over video. But there's a reason why you're not hearing from Khaled today. And that's because he's being prevented from speaking to you. Just days ago, he was slapped with a political ban, prohibiting him from speaking at any events, political activities, demonstrations, so long as he remains in the Federal Republic of Germany, where we live. That's right, for nothing more than his speaking out consistently over the years for justice in Palestine, Khaled Barakat has been banned from speaking. And of course, the German imperialist state never hesitates on an international level to, speak about human rights or speak about democracy. But when it comes to stripping the rights of oppressed people who represent national liberation movements, this same government has no qualms about imposing the most repressive, reactionary, and fascist measures in an attempt to gag the voices that stand for Palestinian rights, and not only for Palestinian rights, but for international struggles for liberation and confronting all forms of exploitation, oppression, and injustice. The imperialist states, along with the Zionist state of Israel, are engaged in a massive siege upon the Palestinian people. And of course, we see this in Gaza, the killer siege that has been taking place for over 12 years, the ongoing imprisonment of thousands of Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails, struggling to achieve their most basic rights, the daily night raids and attacks, the arrests of children, the extrajudicial executions, the shooting and sniping of people in Gaza who march to the border to demand nothing more than their right to return to their homes, the attacks on fishers and farmers in Gaza, the intensified siege on Palestine, the attacks on Palestinians in Jerusalem, the intensified ethnic cleansing, the ongoing and new passage of further and further discriminatory and racist laws targeting Palestinians from 1948 occupied Palestine, those who hold Israeli citizenship. And so when we see actions like this, the political ban on Khaled Barakat, the attempts to pass laws around the world to criminalize support for the Palestinian movement, this is also part and parcel of the same siege that's being imposed by Zionism, imperialism, and reactionary regimes against the Palestinian people. Why are Palestinians being subjected to this siege, and why is Palestine solidarity being besieged? This is because Palestine continues to stand as an example of resistance, of rejection of imperialism, of refusal to concede to 70 years of settler colonialism, of refusal to surrender, to put out the cause and the people and a vision of justice for sale. Palestinians continue to refuse, and they continue to set an example that rejects everything that the imperialist powers wish to impose upon the peoples of the world. And so wherever we march, wherever we protest, whether we're doing so in Brazil, or we're doing it in New York, or we're doing it in Johannesburg, or in Mumbai, or in Manila, or in Hong Kong, or here in Berlin, or in Brussels, or in London, Everywhere where the Palestinian flag stands, it's not just a national symbol. Instead, the Palestinian flag is an international symbol of resistance, an international symbol of revolution, an international symbol that despite killing, despite 70 years of dispossession, despite ongoing racist attacks, despite a massively armed colonial power backed up by the biggest, most massive militaries of the imperialists in the world, that people can continue to resist, that people can continue to organize, that people can continue to fight and struggle for a revolutionary future, for justice, for equality, for self-determination, for national liberation. And so Palestine is an example that must be stopped. The Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people are those who must be liquidated. We see the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations writing in the New York Times and calling for the national suicide of Palestinian culture and identity. We see this kind of genocidal rhetoric being openly espoused in the papers of record of the imperialist world. And so, of course, it is no surprise that we see imperialist powers like Germany imposing a political ban on Palestinian leftists to speak out on an international level, on a Palestinian level, on an Arab level, about how people can, in fact, fight and resist imperialism, and how people can, in fact, imagine and fight for and realize a truly revolutionary and liberated future. In addition, internationally, despite the rise of the far right wing, despite the fact that the Israeli state clearly has an alliance with every far-right reactionary and fascist force in the world today, from Bolsonaro in Brazil to Trump in the United States to the far-right forces here in Europe, like the AfD here in Germany, that are building their political lives on racist attacks on people in migration, on refugees, on communities of color. These are the forces that are lined up around the world with the Israeli state today. And so attacks that are, it's very important to note that this, silencing of Palestinian activists in Europe is not only something that's being done at the behest of the Israeli state, it's also something that is deeply racist. And it's working hand in hand with the most reactionary and fascist forces to silence those who are organizing oppressed communities around the world and inside the imperialist powers themselves. Internationally, despite the power and despite the military might invade on behalf of the colonial settler apartheid state of Israel, despite its backing by the United States, by the European Union, by the Canadian state, the Australian state, all of the settler colonial and imperialist powers lining up alongside the state, which is essentially a military base for imperialism in the region. Despite that fact, and perhaps even because of that fact, international solidarity with the Palestinian people, including within the imperialist powers themselves, is growing. More and more people, trade unions, churches, student movements are joining the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the international movement for the economic, military, political isolation of the Israeli state. They're joining the academic boycott, the cultural boycott. They're calling for a military embargo. And the fact is that Israeli apartheid and colonialism is being exposed before the people of the world for what it truly is, which is a threat to peace, a threat to justice, and an apartheid system that cannot be allowed to continue to repress Palestinians. And so on a daily basis, the Israeli state is really imposing a true state of terror upon the Palestinian people. Marchers who participate in mass peaceful marches to the so-called colonial borders in Gaza, can be shot down by snipers, medics, journalists, reporters, people participating every week going to protest for the right of return denied Palestinians for 71 years, is risking death simply to say that we demand our most basic fundamental human rights. Every night, Palestinian homes are invaded, and young people and mothers and fathers and children are taken from their homes and thrown in the back of military jeeps and interrogated. Palestinian universities are invaded and hundreds of students thrown behind bars because they continue to study and believe in a liberated Palestine. And so, yet the use of the label of terror and terrorism is not imposed on the Israeli state by the imperialist powers. Instead, we see it imposed on the Palestinian people, the Palestinian resistance, and the political movements that are part of Palestinian liberation or have been part of the Palestinian liberation movement. I mean, it's important to note that the majority of the Palestinian people are living in exile and in diaspora, that in 1948, over 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes and lands by Zionist forces in the Nakba, and that those refugees continue to struggle for the right of return that they've been denied until the present day. So when Palestinian liberation movements and organizations are listed on the terror list of the United States, of the European Union, of Canada, of the United Kingdom, this is an attempt to criminalize the very forces that are fighting for justice and liberation in Palestine, and to say that the terrorized are the terrorists, to turn reality on its head. And this is also what we're seeing in these attacks on Palestinians speaking out, when we see Palestinians like the Holy Land Five thrown in jail in the United States for up to 65 years at a time, when we see strugglers like Arab communist revolutionary struggler for Palestine, George Abdullah, jailed in France for 35 years, when we see a political ban imposed on Khaled Barakat, preventing him from meeting, speaking, participating in international events, or even gathering with more than 10 people. And it's being done under the label of, preventing terror. What's actually being done is promoting Israeli terror against the Palestinian people and promoting Zionist and state terror against the Palestinian people. But it's also an attempt to violently and forcibly cut off Palestinians in exile inside the imperialist countries from the very forces and movements that are at the core of their national liberation movement. And this is one reason why it's so critical that we fight against these so-called terror lists, that we fight to bring them to an end, because the fact is that the forces of imperialism are the greatest terrorists in the world today, and that if the peoples of the world were to write their own terror list, it would be almost exactly the opposite of the ones that we see created by these powers and by these states. And instead, these lists are a way to attack liberation movements, to attack people in struggle, from Colombia to the Philippines to Palestine. And these lists provide a pretext for the ongoing criminalization and persecution of our movements. And it's more important than ever that we continue to organize and fight to bring this kind of listing and red tagging and terror baiting to an end. Here in Germany, the political ban on Khaled Barakat is only the latest of a series of attacks. We've seen the deportation of Rasmia Oda, the former Palestinian prisoner and community leader who was also deported from the United States, an anti-BDS movement motion passed by the Bundestag, the German parliament, labeling the movement anti-Semitic. At the same time, the Jewish organizations and individuals that reject Zionist racism, or even its most extreme forms, are also facing state attacks. So we see the Jewish Voice for Peace organization in Germany had its bank account shut down. The director of the Jewish Museum was forced to resign because of simply sharing a tweet criticizing the anti-BDS motion. So any attempt to frame this as a response to anti-Semitism is essentially completely false. And in fact, there's, really, we see police protecting Nazi marches in Berlin at the same time that we see dozens of police sent to shut down a Palestinian to stop him from speaking about the so-called deal of the century that Donald Trump and his cronies and the reactionary Arab regimes in the Israeli state are attempting to impose upon the Palestinian people. And so I want to conclude by saying this. As the International Assembly of ILPS is taking place, there is another conference taking place in Bahrain. It's being called the Economic Conference or the Economic Peace Conference. And what it essentially is an ultra-capitalist program designed to liquidate the cause of the Palestinian people in exchange for a few crumbs of dollars, mostly at the behest of U.S. business people, reactionary Arab regimes and monarchies, and other kind of ultra-capitalist exploitative forces. And the response of Palestinians has been very clear that Palestine is not for sale. And this response has been united and across the board. And when Khaled received the political ban, the event that we were going to, the event that he was going to speak at, was an event about how Palestinians and Arabs and internationals are resisting the so-called deal of the century and the Bahrain conference. So it's this message in particular that the German state did not want to be heard. And as the ILPS conference is the ILPS International Assembly is happening, and as the Bahrain conference is happening, what we see here are two choices, not just for Palestine, but for the world. They are the opposites of one another. In one, we see the most reactionary forces in the world, the most right-wing forces in the world, the most ultra-capitalist and ultra-exploitative forces, the monarchies that behead people, and the imperialist powers that continue to live through extracting the resources and blood and sweat and tears of the peoples of the world. And here we see the ILPS Assembly representing peoples and movements in struggle for justice and for liberation. And so the choice is clear that this is the choice of the enemies that we are facing. This is the choice of the imperialist powers, is an attempt to liquidate the struggles and the peoples that refuse their hegemony and that refuse their power. But that their true power, despite their military might and their millions and billions of dollars, the true power of the people is what we see here in Hong Kong. And it is the kind of organizing and the kind of mobilizing that we see in ILPS that can enable all of our struggles to grow stronger, to defeat the very same forces that are meeting in Bahrain now, in an attempt to stir up war against Iran, in an attempt to confiscate the rights of the Palestinian people. We know that they will not succeed. And we know that through our organizing and our struggle, that we can defeat all of these forces, that we can break down the walls, that we can stop political bans, that we can stop terror baiting, and that we can fight to achieve our goals, that we can confront capitalism and imperialism and Zionism and racism, and we can confront reaction and repression and colonialism. And we can struggle together for a new world of justice, of liberation, of socialism, and of real democracy. Thank you very much. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Freedom for all political prisoners everywhere around the world. Justice, freedom, and liberation for all. Thank you.